In today's lesson, we are going to learn how to use loops and how to write functions in Swift. So to get started, let's go ahead and launch Xcode and get started with a playground. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to call this playground let's do loops and functions. And I'm going to save this to my desktop. We'll hit create here and make this full screen. So, as a programmer, you're most likely going to write a program that requires doing a certain task multiple times until a given condition is met. Say, for example, that you wanted to print out the numbers 1 through 10. Well, with what we already know, we would have to write 10 print statements in order to accomplish that, right? So we would go here and we'd say, okay, print 1, print 2, print 3. And although that may be manageable if we just wanted to print out the first 10 numbers, what if we were trying to print out all of the numbers 1 through 1,000? Well, that would be quite the tedious process, right? So loops are an awesome programming tool that we have to be able to complete a task multiple times. Now, there are two primary loops that we are going to talk about today. The first is what we call a for loop. Okay, and a for loop is used to iterate through a list of things. So let me show you the basic structure of a for loop. In order to write a for loop, I'm going to start with the word for, and you can see that we get the autocomplete option here. So if you click on that, we can see what the basic structure is for our for loop. Okay, so we can see that we have a for item in items. So for each individual item in a set of items, run this piece of code, right? So whatever's in the braces here, the curly braces, is going to be the code that is run for each item in a collection of items. Okay? So this first item here, this can be called whatever we want. This is our creation of a variable that can be used within the loop. So back to our initial task, right? Printing out all of the numbers 1 through 10. Let's go ahead and call this number. Okay, so for number, and again, I could say for number, I could say for x, I could say for y, or for z. It doesn't really matter. This is going to be the constant that I use inside of my loop. Okay, so we're going to say for number in, and then remember to create a range, I'm going to put the first number in my range, followed by a dot, 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 and then the last number in my range. Okay, so for number in numbers 1 to 10, what do I want to do? Well, I want to print out that number, right? So for number in 1 through 10, print out my number, and we'll run our code, and we see that our for loop has done all of the work for us, right? It's printed out numbers 1 through 10. Okay, so let's think about this for a sec. What's happening here is that, again, we have this named constant, and we are assigning a number in our range to that constant each time we iterate through the code. Okay, so we're going to iterate through this code 10 times, and you can see that over here on this right pane, that the code is going to iterate through 10 different numbers. Each number will be assigned to my number constant, and then we can use that constant to print out our number. Okay. We could even do this for larger ranges, like if I wanted to print numbers 1 through 1,000 and run the code. And we can see that it runs the code 1,000 times. Okay. So what if we don't care much about printing out these numbers and we'd rather run some other code a certain number of times? If you've ever driven in a car with young kids, you know that the number one question they ask is, are we there yet? So what if I wanted to print off that question 100 times? Well, I'll start my for loop here. So let's go ahead and we'll do another for loop. I'm going to lower this back down to 10 just so we're not printing out so much. Okay, and so I'm going to say for, and then let's go ahead and autocomplete it. And we want to print out, are we there yet 100 times? Okay, so I'm going to do, our items is going to be 1 through 100. Okay, so 100 times here. and we want to print out, are we there yet? Okay, so the question is, why did I leave this placeholder here? Well, I'm not actually doing anything with a named constant here, right? Because I'm just printing out, are we there yet, each time that we iterate through the loop. So I don't actually need a named constant in order for my program to run. So what I can do here is I can actually make this an underscore, okay? And what this is saying is, well, I don't actually need this named constant, so let's go ahead and just have it an underscore, but I still want to print out this code 100 times. Okay, so we'll go ahead and run that, and we can see that it runs through my code 100 times and prints, are we there yet? 100 times. Okay, so as you can see, these loops are super useful in programming, and you'll get a lot more practice with them as time goes on. So let's go ahead and do one more example. Let's say that I want to print out the numbers 1 to 100, but I only want to actually print the numbers that are a multiple of 3. Okay, well, how do we start out? We're going to start with our 4 here, and we're going to say for x or y or z or whatever you want in 1 to 100, then what? If we want to know if a number is divisible by another number, what do we use? Think back to our arithmetic lesson. If you thought modulo or the percentage sign thing, then you're right. Remember that the modulo operator can be used to check divisibility, because we know that if the result of our modulo equation is 0, then x would be divisible by y. So in the body of our for loop, let's go ahead and say if x modulo 3 is equal to 0, then I want to print out the number. Okay, but I only want to print out, or I want to print out x, and I only want to print out x if it's a multiple of 3. Okay, so we'll go ahead and run this code, and we can see that it iterates through the code 33 times. Okay, and it looks correct. We are doing 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, right? Those are all multiples of 3. Now, another really cool thing that we can do with these for loops is that we can actually check the condition before actually entering our loop, right? So in this case, we have our loop, and then in the body of our loop, we're checking a condition. Well, with for loops, what you can do is we could say for x in 1 to 100, and instead of using that if, we're going to use a where here, okay? So where x modulo 3 is equal to 0, then let's print out x. Okay, and this will accomplish the same thing. You can see here that the code was run 33 times, and that we're using a where here instead of an if, but they both accomplish the same thing.